Hello, and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and today I'm happy to bring you the next part of our series on the operational career of the Brewster Buffalo. This one will bring us to the end of the second major part of this account, the story of the Buffalo in the service of the British Commonwealth, resisting the Japanese invasion of Malaya and Singapore. As usual, the sources used to prepare this video can be found in the description. This one will likely be somewhat longer than the last few, so with no further delay, let's get back into it. Throughout December, despite the carnage inflicted on the Allied air forces in the peninsula, Singapore Island was more or less free of Japanese air intrusion, with the exception of the first day of the war. The raids this day began just a couple hours after the first waves went ashore at Kota Baru. The initial sortie was made by 34 G3M Nell naval bombers of the Genzan Kokutai, which had set out late the previous night from bases in Indochina, a little over 600 miles or almost 1,000 kilometers away. The bombers encountered severe weather and turned back. But a few hours later, a group of 31 more G3Ms from the Mihoro Kokutai took off from Thu Dai Moi, a field just north of Saigon, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Yagoro Shibata, to carry out the raid on the island. The weather turned back 14 of this group, but the remaining 17 pressed on. They were picked up at 0320 hours by the radar station at Mersing on the East Malay coast, still 75 miles or 120 kilometers out. Formation arrived over Singapore just after 0400, and bombs started falling at 0415 exactly. They were met with mostly inaccurate anti-aircraft fire from guns on the island, as well as from the ships of Force Z, which was then still in the harbor, resulting in minor damage to one of the raiders. Despite the radar warning, 3 Buffaloes of 453 Squadron, then held in readiness at Sembawang airfield, were ordered to stay on the ground to give the flak a clear field of fire. Civil defense personnel were few in number and lacking in experience, and as a result blackout measures were only partially applied, and the city was well lit. Several targets were attacked, including Seletar and Tengai airfields, the naval base and Keppel Harbor. 3 airmen were killed at Seletar, and 3 Blenheims damaged at Tengai. The largest number of bombs hit the city itself, on districts the inhabitants of which were mostly Chinese or Sikh, killing 61 of them. General Percival had this to say about this first exposure of Singapore to the reality of war, quote, "Somewhere about 4 a.m. the sirens went off, and shortly afterwards came the well-known sound of falling bombs. Most of them were directed against the aerodromes, but a few fell in the very center of town and did some damage. For some reason, the headquarters of the Civil ARP organization, Civil Defense Organization, had not been manned, and lights were still on in some of the streets when the airplanes arrived. Not that this really made that much difference, for there was no mistaking the waterfront at Singapore even at night. It must be admitted that this raid came rather as a surprise, for the nearest Japanese aerodromes were 700 miles from Singapore, which was a considerable distance, and we hardly expected the Japanese to have any very long-range aircraft. It was a bold enterprise on their part. It's also the first indication most of the citizens of Singapore had that the war had broken out. Percival's surprise at the reach of the Japanese bombers was reflected in the impression of a wildebeest pilot whose squadron was stationed at Seletar. Quote, "I personally expected that the Japs had come off a carrier, and that we were going to attack it with torpedoes. I also imagined that the Japs would not waste the opportunity with such a small raid, but would return later. I was wrong in both cases. Given that the G3M was a fairly large twin-engine bomber, an unlikely type to be used on a carrier, it is interesting that this man thought it was more likely that they came off of a carrier than that these bombers could have range sufficient to threaten Singapore from a land base. In fact, Allied personnel often record their surprise at the range of Japanese naval aircraft in the first months of the war, not just here, but everywhere they were encountered. Poor information on Japanese capabilities seems to have been more or less universal at this time, at least among the English-speaking Allies. At least one Buffalo pilot, 243 Squadron Sergeant Jeff Fiskin, recorded the effect the experience this raid had on his estimation of the opposition. Quote, "We were standing outside the swimming club when the Japanese planes flew over. As we watched them just flying around, showing us what they could do, we quickly realized that the pre-war stories we'd been told about the Japs' flying skills were far from the truth. In fact, the early Japanese pilots were highly skilled. This perception was perhaps related to this man's going on to be one of the most effective of the Buffalo pilots in the course of the air war in Malaya. Others were also shaken awake by this initial raid, and when the air raid siren sounded on the night of the 9th, civil defense measures were much improved, even though this turned out to be a false alarm." C.N. Morrison writes, quote, "When we looked down on the city from the watchtower where we lived, there was hardly a light to be seen. Zealous Chinese volunteers, mostly young men, who formed the backbone of the ARP and all auxiliary services, threw themselves into the task of blacking Singapore out as much as they might have thrown themselves into some game. The slightest chink of light at a window would provoke frenzied shots from the street below. Drivers of cars were stopped if their lights were thought to be the smallest degree on the bright side. Anyone attempting to light a cigarette in the street would have been fiercely pounced upon from all sides. A few fines were imposed, but the zeal of the Chinese wardens and the desire of the population to comply with the regulations rendered these fines hardly necessary. Singapore's first air raid was not serious enough to cause panic, but it served as a spur to galvanize all the civil defense organizations into wartime activity. After this first day, Singapore was left almost entirely alone by Japanese bombers. Little enemy air activity at all occurred here during most of the period of fighting on the peninsula, with the exception of the reconnaissance planes that daily kept the installations there under observation. The occasional attempt to intercept these snoopers were the only combat missions flown by the fighters here, with the exception of reconnaissance flights flown by the converted machines used by the 4th Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. On the 12th, the same day that the initial detachment of 243 Squadron was dispatched to Ipoh, the Commonwealth forces here were reinforced by a squadron of 12 Buffaloes from the Colonial Air Force of the Dutch East Indies. This was undertaken in accord with a pre-war agreement between the two colonial powers, which also included basing of Dutch bombers and patrol aircraft on Singapore. Led by Captain Jacob van Helsdingen, the squadron, which was designated 2 VLG-2, arrived at Kallang airfield from Weitenzorg on the island of Java, to the southwest of the Malay Peninsula. These Dutch Buffaloes were a different model than the Buffalo Mark Is used by the British and Commonwealth units, and lacked the armor-glass windscreens of the British machines. Windscreens from wrecked or unserviceable British machines were quickly swapped out into the Dutch Buffaloes. One of 488 Squadron's ground crew, leading aircraftman Max Boyd, had just finished fitting the armor plates to his own squadron's Buffaloes when he was turned to fitting out the Dutch planes. He recorded his impression of the newcomers thus, quote, "The Dutch pilots are magnificent as both men and flyers, best on the island. Some have thousands of hours of flying time logged. Leo Arden was another leading aircraftman, and myself are seconded to one of their more modern Buffaloes as ground crew till their own maintenance crews arrive. Our squadron has supplied several ground crew. Their planes are much faster than ours and have self-sealing fuel tanks." Next day, 453 Squadron began its move to Ipoh, leaving the depleted 243 Squadron and the newly minted 488 Squadron, along with the Dutch, to guard the island. A late morning intrusion by a high-flying Ki-46 reconnaissance plane resulted in the scramble of all fighters at Kallang airfield. Some of the eagerness and also the inexperience of the pilots here comes through in the writing of 453 Squadron's diarist. Quote, "Great excitement today. All machines were ordered into air as quickly as possible. Aircraft were taking off in all directions, 243 opening up from their dispersal point, the Netherlands East Indies Squadron doing ditto, and old 488 beating them all. We had 16 aircraft off in 6 minutes. The ground crew worked like hardened veterans, put unserviceable aircraft serviceable just for the sake of getting them into the air. Pilot Officer McAneny and Sergeant McIntosh took off without ammunition. From the spectator's point of view, a Hendon display, which was an air show back then, was tame after Kalang's effort. However, it turned out to be a false alarm, but nevertheless we learned a lot. We found that 488 could get into the air in record time, and also that all pilots use their heads in an emergency. God help any Jap who pokes his nose into Singapore. But little action was seen by the fighters left on Singapore for the rest of the month. Some good use was made of this time to improve readiness on the island. Defenses and shelters on the airfields were improved, and the island's many sporting fields had trenches dug across them to prevent them being used in Japanese airborne landings. Squadron leader Howell of 243 Squadron was in particular worried about the lack of air-sea rescue facilities, and successfully obtained half a dozen small naval auxiliaries for this life-saving work. These were placed in charge of Flight Lieutenant R.C. Moore, and based at Singapore and the surrounding small islands, and arrangements made for these craft to operate along with the commandeered civilian aircraft of the Malay Volunteer Air Force in an air-sea rescue role. Howell also saw to it that his aviators were equipped with anything that could be given to allow them to survive and escape capture if forced down on the peninsula. Quote, "There were only land rations and first aid kits in the aircraft. Owing to the most unpleasant country over which we were flying, and lack of any organization for a search and rescue of pilots landing in the jungle, good kit was essential. It was difficult to get quickly. However, in the end, all the pilots of 243 Squadron carried a parang, so a type of knife, a rope, white coveralls, mosquito netting and cream, money, cigarettes, matches, Malay to English essential phrases, a pocket compass, etc., etc. Revolvers were almost impossible to obtain, although NCOs on ground duties at Seletar were bearing them. Operations on the island were limited to patrols, occasional reconnaissance flights, and attempts to intercept Japanese reconnaissance, which were hindered by the Buffalo's inadequate speed and climbing performance. Exceptions to the quiet occurred, such as a surprise low-level raid on Tenga by two Ki-21 twin-engine bombers on the night of the 16th, 17th. This did no real damage, but caused the cancellation of an offensive mission by the Blenheim squadron based there. Another alarm on the evening of the 22nd led to the scrambling of fighters to intercept a flight of 4 bombers detected approaching the city from the sea. These proved to be RAF Hudsons, sent from Australia to reinforce their bomber squadrons on Singapore. Air HQ at Singapore had not been notified of their arrival, and likewise, the Hudson crews were not aware that the orders in Singapore were to assume that any unknown aircraft flying in formation were hostile. They had come from Darwin via Dutch stations at Koepang and Surabaya, where they had also been intercepted by Dutch fighters. Luckily, no fire was exchanged, and the Hudsons landed safely. They and another group of 4 that arrived the next day were distributed to 2 RAF Hudson squadrons. An indication of the coming intrusion of the war into this comparatively quiet period came with the return of the 2 shattered RAF Buffalo squadrons to Sembawang after the withdrawal from Kuala Lumpur. With them seemed to come a breath of the desperate situation they had seen, and the latent distrust between rulers and ruled inherent in the colonial territories manifested itself in this time of stress and danger as a fear of treachery and acts of sabotage, as recorded by 453 Squadron Sergeant H. H. Griffiths. Quote, "Once back at Sembawang, we flew many sorties, airdrome defense, and reconnaissance. About this time, there was considerable speculation regarding fifth column and sabotage, particularly after one of the Hudsons completely lost power while attempting to take off. After returning to the run-up position, and again checking the pre-flight procedure, and everything checked normal, again the aircraft lost all power and was made unserviceable. The Hudson CO then took the aircraft, and the same thing happened. When they investigated, they found a number of squares of brown paper in the air intake, which, when under full power, would rise, shutting off the air. I returned from a mission, dropped my gear on my bed, including a map that I'd been using, stripped off and went for a shower, which was on the other side of our barrack. Having forgotten something, I went back into my room. There, to my surprise, was the chap who acted as Batman. He had opened my map, which he was studying. I think he may have been Indian or Eurasian. I asked him what he was doing, and he said that he was interested to know where I'd been. I felt that I should report this, which I did, and that was the last I saw of him. Meanwhile, on the mainland, a Ki-27 fighter was shot down by flak over Port Swettenham, modern Port Klang, or just Klang, and the pilot, 19-year-old Corporal Matsuo Matsumoto, was captured. Like many Japanese POWs, this man initially resisted interrogation, but became rather forthcoming once this nod to military tradition was overcome and the prisoner became convinced that he was not in danger of being tortured or killed outright. He revealed that he flew for the Tanimura Buntai, a unit flying now out of Sungai Petani. This prompted a photographic reconnaissance Buffalo mission to the captured airfield. Flying at 25,000 feet, Buffalo evaded 3 fighters that attempted to intercept, found well over 100 planes on the ground at Sungai Petani, apparently the majority being fighter types. The Blenheims and Hudsons based at Tengai and Sembawang hit the airfield, destroying 8 or 9 Sonya-type light bombers belonging to the 27th Sentai. Japanese planes flying from Sungai Petani attacked shipping in the Malacca Strait and at Port Swettenham the next day. The gunners at this location proved accurate again, downing not a Japanese plane this time, but one of the 3 Blenheims sent to reconnoiter the situation. Another bombing raid was mounted against Sungai Petani by Blenheims on the night of the 28th-29th December, with unrecorded results, and the loss of 1 more aircraft. The exemption from bombing enjoyed by Singapore ended on the night of December 29th and 30th, when a series of small-scale attacks on targets around the island occurred. 1 Army bomber, a Ki-48 from the 75th Sentai, hit oil tanks, starting multiple fires. But most of the attacks this night were the work of the Japanese Navy, specifically the Genzan Kokutai, which sent 8 G3Ms to hit Seletar, a dozen to strike Keppel Harbor, and 9 more the city itself. The damage caused was not very severe, but it demonstrated the vulnerability of the island, and gave a worrying indication of what was coming. With 27 Squadron, the Blenheim night fighter unit, effectively decimated, the Allies had little fighter defense against night raids. Squadron leader Frank Howell of 488 Squadron had made an attempt to remedy this lack during the previous 2 weeks. He had 2 of his Buffaloes painted black and modified to dampen their exhaust flames, to suit them better for operations on moonlit nights, flying in conjunction with the remaining Blenheim 1F night fighters. They were put to the test on the night of New Year's Eve, when the city of Singapore was raided again by a formation of Mihoro Kokutai G3Ms. Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden was set up to intercept, as he relates, quote, "On this occasion, the radar gave me a course far out over the China Sea for an interception of an approaching force of enemy bombers, and the course plotting was very accurate, but I never saw them except for a fleeting flash of aircraft below me, only feet below me, and then nothing but the black night again. I particularly remember the occasion because it was New Year's Eve, and my instrument panel clock showed that it was midnight, and I thought what a funny place to be spending New Year's, in a Buffalo at 22,000 feet over the China Sea. Later, on looking at the chart and the plotted courses of the enemy and myself, I was told that I must have flown straight through the formation of bombers on a diagonal course, without knowing it." Other measures were taken to modify the fighters to make them more effective. Group Captain Macaulay, the station commander at Sembawang Field, records one of these field modification projects. Quote, "I had removed 2 of the guns from the Brewster Buffaloes in order to lighten them, but still retaining enough weaponry to fight against the Zero. I reduced the ammunition by half, and with these modifications alone I was able to lighten the fighter by 1,000 pounds. Wherever we could, we fared the Buffalo to reduce drag and improve its performance. We fared over the gun ports and we lightened the radio equipment. These changes were carried out by the ground crew of the squadron. The result was with these improvements, our Buffalo fighters were able to almost match the Zeros in performance. Now our fighter pilots were gaining confidence, after initially having been given a hard time in battle." Other Buffaloes were also modified to reduce weight and drag, often by removing unneeded or problematic equipment. Some had the bulky 50 caliber wing guns replaced by 303 caliber weapons, which in addition to being reliable were lighter. Other commonly deleted items were the cockpit heater, parachute flare bin, and the Very pistol, which was a kind of flare gun used for signaling, and its bracket, as well as the external radio aerial mast, which was replaced by an internal aerial. Also, the practice was adopted of carrying a standard fuel load of only 80 gallons instead of the normal 130. These measures significantly improved the performance of the Buffalo Mark I, with an increase in speed of 30 miles an hour, almost 50 kph being seen in some cases. Meanwhile, the Japanese advance on the peninsula was proceeding rapidly as 1941 drew to an end. In the vanguard, a battalion-sized force was pushing down the west coast. They used a group of 7 steamers captured at Penang to tow some of the barges and landing craft used in the initial landings at Singora and brought overland from Siam. In the course of their advance, they were augmented by specialists from the 11th Regiment. By New Year's Eve, this flotilla was off the mouth of the Burnham River, from which position they could threaten Kuala Lumpur and Port Swettenham. They were attacked by small numbers of Blenheims and Dutch Glen Martin bombers. This failed to make an impression on the Japanese, and resulted in a few of the bombers being lost to Key 43 fighters from the 59th Sentai. One of the Dutch bombers reported being fired on by Buffaloes, but as none were active in the area at this time, this was almost certainly due to misidentification. These actions had no effect on the Japanese advance. The airfields of Singapore were all hit that night. Tengai received the attention of 2 Key 48s and 3 Key 21s from the 98th Sentai, while Sembawang, Seletar, and Kelang were hit by a total of 25 Navy bombers from the Mihoro Kokutai. These raids achieved little except the destruction of 3 swordfish used by a No. 4 Anti-Aircraft Cooperation Unit at Tenga. The British hit back with 3 Blenheims that hit Kuala Pest Airfield, where the 98th Sentai was based. And this had better luck, destroying a pair of Key 21s and damaging about 20 more on the ground. A pair of Catalinas were also armed with bombs and sent to make an attack on the field at Gong Kada, the results of which appear to have been negligible. On January 3rd, the first naval convoy, bearing reinforcements for the island, codenamed BM-9A, was due, and all Buffalo squadrons on the island were tasked with providing continuous air cover, sending relays of fighters out at intervals beginning at 0700. Bad weather made the ships hard to find, shielding them from the enemy but also complicating the task of the escorts. Sergeant Vin Arthur of 243 Squadron was up with a section of 6 Buffaloes when they met the ships just after 1600 hours, as the convoy was entering the Johor Straits. He later wrote, quote, "We met the convoy out in the straits and split up into 3 sections. The first and second sections flew either side of the ships at 1,000 feet, while Mara and I, in the third section, acted as top cover at 6,000 feet. We didn't see any hostile aircraft. A-Flight sent up 6 planes to relieve us, but they couldn't find the convoy. As a result, we had to stay on till the convoy was safely in port, the trip lasting 2 hours and 50 minutes. A section from A-Flight, Bonham and Powell, got lost in cloud and were separated from the rest of their flight. All B Flight and the remainder of A Flight were trying to land at the same time in the dusk. Mr. Bowes had his guns switched on, and when he came in to land, he accidentally fired a burst over the 488 squadron machines. So far, no casualties have been reported. The convoy made harbor safely, but 2 Buffaloes became lost in the course of the day's flying and were forced to put down in the sea for lack of fuel. Both pilots survived, but with injuries. No enemy interference with the convoy on this last leg of its journey was reported. This may seem surprising given the Japanese naval and air superiority that had now been established, but it reflects the full confidence that the enemy now had in their victory. The Japanese were more interested in preventing ships from leaving the Malaya-Singapore area, because the escaping troops and whatever weapons could be got away would eventually have to be subdued later in their campaigns somewhere else. They were much less concerned about those bringing reinforcements into the island. In view of the strategic situation, there was little that these could realistically do but delay for a short while the eventual fall of Singapore and increase the Japanese haul of prisoners and war material. Further, smashing this convoy could prevent the dispatch of others, cargoes of which would be more dangerous to the Japanese if sent to Burma or elsewhere. In response to the escalation of the raids on the airfields, key personnel were relocated away from the fields themselves, and a new fighter operations command was formed as part of 224 Group, under Wing Commander George Darley. He was assisted by a Battle of Britain Ace squadron leader Richard Brooker, who was posted to the staff of Air HQ and also flew some missions with 488 Squadron in an attempt to pass on his experience. However, reorganization efforts were hampered by the reality on the ground, as noted by Squadron Leader Howell in this comment on the arrangements. Quote, Group Captain Rice has completed plans for the formation of 224 Group, and I understand that the establishment has been approved by Air Ministry. However, owing to the lack of aircraft to warrant a large establishment, this was never brought into being. If, however, reinforcements had arrived in time, the staff would have been far too small to deal with the situation, and lack of personnel with war experience would have been very serious. Even as it was, the only officers who had any experience of controlling an ops room in Malaya or Singapore were Wing Commander Darley, Squadron Leader Clouston, and myself. Wing Commander Chignell had been posted to the fleet. Wing Commander Darley was up country a great deal, so it meant that Squadron Leader Clouston and I had to run a squadron and spend 8 to 12 hours daily in the ops room at the same time. Other officers did not seem inclined or willing to learn. These duties included giving civilian and service air raid warnings to the island. Even so, these days were really the calm before the storm. Japanese air activity over the island was still mostly limited to small-scale raids and reconnaissance flights, and the Buffalo pilots engaged in mostly unsuccessful interceptions, scouting and top-cover flights for ships, and strafing missions against Japanese ground forces and amphibious craft. Many training flights were carried out, and these resulted in the loss of 7 aircraft in accidents during the first week of the new year alone, 2 of these resulting in the deaths of the pilots. Meanwhile, the Japanese were moving their air forces up behind the ground troops. 64th Sentai and its Hayabusas were now at Ipoh, and the Ki-21 equipped 60th and 98th Bomber Sentais based nearby. Knowledge of the arrival of the Japanese here was met with a night raid by a dozen wildebeests fitted with long-range tanks. These were able to wreck and set aflame a pair of fighters on the ground at Ipoh, with others receiving various degrees of damage. It was not long after that, on the 10th of January, that 243 Squadron scored its first victory of the campaign, despite having detachments in the combat zone for over a month. This was a Ki-46 reconnaissance aircraft, known as a Dyna to the Allies, from the 81st Independent Chutai of the Japanese Army Air Force. This was the work of Sergeants Bert Wapiti and Charlie Cronk, who were vectored in on a radar track by the fighter controller on the ground. For Cronk, this would be the first of 6 enemy planes he claimed flying the Buffalo. He described the action in a newspaper interview at the time in these words, quote, I came up from underneath it and saw the big body of the airplane, its great red circles on the wings right over my head. Then I pressed the tit and emptied everything I had into her. I kept firing until all my ammunition was gone. She was burning all the way to the ground, but the Japs seemed to think they could land her. But just as she flattened out, she seemed to burst into flames all over, and an enormous sheet of flame shot up and disappeared into the treetops. Wapiti, quoted in the same interview, was somewhat more laconic about his role. Quote, I slipped down from above and gave him a burst in the motor. Meanwhile, the ground battle had seen the Allied armies push steadily southwards. By the night of the 10th, the Japanese were in Kuala Lumpur, Port Swettenham having fallen not long before. Some demolitions were carried out to deny the airfields here to the Japanese, but these were left incomplete due to the proximity of the rapidly advancing Japanese troops. Nevertheless, the booby traps and other measures were such that the RAF men involved estimated that it would be a few weeks at least before the fields could be put back into operation by the Japanese. The Japanese got around the need for caution in this process by making Australian POWs clear these obstructions. Some of these unfortunates were killed or maimed in the process, and Kuala Lumpur airfield was operational in Japanese hands within just 3 days. Bad weather on the 11th kept both sides on the ground. By the 12th, the Japanese Army Air Force had completed their forward move to the newly captured airfields, and with the move of the 12th Flying Battalion, its 2 Sentais of Ki 27 fighters to Kuantan, virtually the whole of the Japanese Army Air Force in the theater was now based on the captured airfields of northern and central Malaya, and the bombing of Singapore could begin in earnest. Once again, the airfields were among the first targets, as the Japanese aimed to crush the Allied air forces in preparation for the attack across the straits on the island itself. In addition to bombing raids, offensive fighter sweeps were used in a bid to lure the Buffaloes up to battle. One such opened the Singapore Blitz, and no fewer than 72 Ki 27s from the Kuantan-based Sentais came down from the north. 8 Buffaloes from 488 Squadron were in the air to meet them. Soon another flight of 6 was racing into the air, as well as 3 of the Dutch fighters. The Dutchmen were actually the first to engage, along with a lone 488 Squadron machine that had formed up on them. They were quickly overwhelmed and escaped into clouds before any hits were taken on either side. Minutes later, the rest of 488 was bounced by about 30 of the enemy fighters. This lopsided battle was the New Zealanders' first engagement, and it went badly for them. 2 of their Buffaloes were shot down by the Nates on their first pass. One of these planes was flown by Sergeant Rod McMillan, who described it later in these words, quote, "There was a group of Japanese aircraft sort of playing around and doing aerobatics at about 15,000 feet. We had been climbing up and we were higher than them. When we turned towards them, we were badly jumped by higher up aircraft in the sun. I don't think Mackenzie saw them, and I didn't see them until I was on the receiving end. They, the lower group, were the bait and enticed us in. I was just lining up a bead on one of these Jap aircraft when I received an ungodly belt from behind. I think it virtually knocked me out, and when I came to, the plane was spinning out of control. I tried to get it under control, but I had no success, so I had to assume the tail was virtually blown off. And so I bailed out. I think I was below 10,000 feet. I was scared that I might be shot at, but nothing like that happened. I landed in a rubber plantation with the parachute all tangled up in the bananas of a rubber tree. I couldn't get it down, so I just left it there." He and the other downed pilot, Sergeant Terry Honan, landed on the same plantation across the straits in Johor Province, within a few hundred yards of one another. Both were injured, but able to walk, and were picked up by an Australian Army officer, then driven back to Singapore in a jeep. 5 other Buffaloes took damage in this clash. One of the Japanese units involved, the 11th Sentai, claimed to have destroyed 10. None of the Japanese intruders were confirmed lost. Just a few minutes after the fighter sweep came a formation of about 27 bombers, escorted by 42 Hayabusas from the 59th and 64th Sentais, targeting Tengai Airfield. 243 Squadron was ordered up, but the warning came too late, and the Buffaloes were unable to make contact. One of the bombers was claimed as a probable by one of the Dutch pilots still in the air, Ensign F. Swartz. 9 planes from the combined 21-453 Squadron were sent up from Semboang to intercept. They made contact with the bomber formation after its attack, but the Japanese saw them coming. Much to the chagrin of the Australians, the unladen bombers put on full power and ran for it in a shallow dive, leaving the fighters behind. They would have another chance at the Japanese that afternoon, when a second Ki 27 fighter sweep in similar strength approached Singapore in misty conditions. Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden was caught in a frantic battle with several of the Nates. He downed 2 of the enemy aircraft with another probable. His aircraft was shot up and his wing dented by the impact of one of the Japanese fighters' radio aerials. So closely was this battle fought. Nonetheless, he managed to land his damaged plane safely. 3 more Nates were shot down by 243 Squadron in this battle, 2 by Flying Officer Blondie Holder, and 1 by Sergeant Jeff Fiskin, who gained his first confirmed air-to-air victory this day, as he relates, quote, "One turned towards me and I went down, and we both kept firing at one another. I recall seeing his cannon shells coming at me. Luckily, I pulled up and he went downwards. He blew up beneath me. Next thing my plane went into what seemed like an uncontrollable inverted spin, reacting to the exploding Japanese plane. Unable to correct it, I decided to get out, but I couldn't disconnect my oxygen mask. The problem was apparently a result of a modification made to my helmet, which was made from very soft snakeskin, bought from the reptile store in Singapore. The oxygen mask wouldn't button onto this helmet, which opened from the back and was then tightened up after you put it on. I got around this problem by sewing the helmet onto the oxygen mask. The mask was connected to a stainless steel oxygen tube by a bayonet-type junction. Stray bullet had gone right into this arrangement, stopping it from loosening. It'll break, I thought, as I clambered out, but it didn't, and I was left hanging from the side of the plane, swinging by my head and my hands, as it continued its spin towards oblivion. So I got back into my spinning plane. I had begun to see scenes from my life, my childhood, and my family farm back in Gisborne, flashing before my eyes. I remember little else happening as my plane spun on its 4-mile journey towards the ground. Somehow it managed to come out of the spin, and I was able to pull it back onto an even keel and return to base. This was the one occasion in the war when I had the experience of seeing my life playing before me. It must have been pretty close to checking out. Don't ask me how I did it, but I must have done all the right things. 3 Dutch Buffaloes also fought this second wave of Ki-27s, countering 9 of them at 13,000 feet. They shot down 4 of the fighters, but lost 2 of their own. That flown by Lieutenant August Deville, who was forced to bail out of his stricken plane after downing 2 of the enemy, and that of Sergeant Gerardus Brugink, who also took down a Ki-27, but was forced to crash land. The Japanese Navy also ventured its first daylight raid on Singapore this day. The naval bomber offensive would rely on the 22nd Air Flotilla, which consisted of 3 bomber Kokutais flying G3M and G4M bombers, along with a fighter group using A6Ms and the older fixed undercarriage A5Ms. These were based in Borneo and Siam. 81 bombers took off to hit the island this day, but heavy weather en route forced them all to turn back. The next day on the 13th, another reinforcement convoy, codenamed DM-1, arrived in Singapore Harbor, bringing with them a batch of 51 Hawker Hurricane fighters in crates, along with 24 pilots. As a result of the Hurricanes being aboard, a maximum fighter effort to protect the convoy was ordered, with Air HQ indicating that this was desirable even at the cost of all remaining Buffaloes being lost. Like the previous convoy, this one arrived shrouded by heavy weather, and was hard to spot from the air. But this was more or less irrelevant as the Japanese had no plans to attack this convoy. Instead, they aimed to make another attempt at their aborted raid of the previous day. Once again, 81 bombers set out, but due to weather, only a handful of G4Ms were able to hit their primary target, which just happened to be Keppel Harbor, the convoy's destination. This convinced many on the Allied side that the convoy was being targeted. A group of 30 G3Ms from the Mihoro Coup headed for Singapore were spotted by the 8 Buffaloes on convoy escort duty, who moved in to intercept. The fighters chased down the bombers and began an attack from astern. However, they were shredded by the defensive fire of the bomber formation. 6 of the Buffaloes were badly damaged and the whole formation driven off. 2 were compelled to ditch in the sea, and another to force land at Tenga. This action includes rare instances of 2 phenomena of aerial combat. 1, the total repulsion of fighter attack by defensive fire of a bomber formation, and 2, underclaiming of air-to-air victories by airmen, as the Japanese gunners only claimed hits on 3 of the Buffaloes. The only Allied success to balance against this massacre was that of Pilot Officer Wally Greenhoff, who damaged one of the bombers, as he relates, quote, "The only partial success I had was that I probably got a Jap bomber. We had 8 aircraft in the air. Because at that stage we were struggling to get any more than 8 to 10 aircraft up. I was flying number 2 to Johnny Hutchison, and got behind and above these Navy Type 96 bombers. I managed to get a couple of decent bursts into them from behind, and then we were driven off. There were a few zeros on our tails, and the last I saw was one bomber disappearing with smoke coming out of one engine, but whether it crashed or got home I wouldn't know." Later that day, 243 Squadron was back in action against a small group of Ki-51 light bombers escorted by a pair of Ki-43s. 6 Buffaloes scrambled in heavy rain and climbed as the Hayabusas peeled off and dove for them. One flight ducked into cloud cover and became scattered. Flight Lieutenant Garden describes what happened when he emerged again into clear air. Quote, "Dead ahead I saw some single-engine Japanese aircraft that had not seen me. I stalked them, and when I got close enough I chose one particular victim. At that very moment he saw me, and we went into a tight turn, but I was able to hold him. With a long burst I crippled him, and he dived into the ground." Another section of 243 Squadron tangled with a group of 8 Ki-43s covering a group of 27 twin-engine bombers headed for Kelang. One of the Japanese fighters was shot down by a pilot of 488 Squadron flying with 243, Pilot Officer Noel Sharp. This was his first confirmed victory, coming on the heels of a probable the day before. Another was jointly credited to Sergeant Kronk and Pilot Officer Pevriel, as the latter recalls, quote, "There were 2 of us. There was supposed to be a fighter sweep over Singapore. It was fairly cloudy, and we flew around for quite a long time. And we didn't see them until way up above us there were about 50 Zeros heading back home. Needless to say, we let them go. They looked to be about 10,000 feet above us, and 2 of us weren't going to do too much harm to them. Looked like suicide to me. We finally did get onto one. He must have had engine trouble because he was streaming smoke. We managed to get close up to him. fired at him and he disappeared into the oil smoke clouds. Whether we hit him or not, I don't know, but he was still going fast and trailing smoke. One of 488's men did not return from this sortie. This was Sergeant Russ Reynolds, a 19-year-old native of Wellington. His Buffalo was last seen diving into the sea south of Singapore. The weather over Singapore was poor on the 14th, and this probably was the reason for the lack of Japanese raids this day. In fact, Navy bombers had once again set out for the island but turned back. Some Navy planes were again sighted over the island, however, in the form of a reconnaissance plane with a small escort of Zeros. A section of Buffaloes from 243 Squadron had been in the air and went after them. One of the pilots, Jeff Fiskin, who had just changed the harmonization of his guns and changed his ammunition mixture in an attempt to better suit the kind of combat he was now anticipating, as he writes, quote, I had made 2 modifications to my Buffalo to substantially increase its killing power. I'd noticed that the bullets that had hit my own plane were spread out all over, without having caused significant harm, so I obtained permission to modify my guns so that they would fire in a narrower arc. It wasn't generally recommended, but the result was a much greater concentration of firepower. The second modification was in the type of ammunition used. This was adopted by all of us. At first we were only allowed to use solid machine gun ammunition, the old British idea that you had to be a gentleman and all that. It wasn't for us, and we soon began using a combination of armor-piercing, incendiary, tracer, and ordinary solid bullets. The incendiaries were particularly effective. Once you saw smoke starting to appear from your target, it's almost certainly a sign of success. The last 200 rounds were all tracer to let you know when your gun's ammunition was used up. We weren't supposed to use more than 8 seconds of firing in one burst, partly because a plane can only carry a small amount of ammo, and second because the performance of the guns deteriorates after they get hot. These changes may have paid off. Fiskin claimed one of the Zero escorts as probable, which was later confirmed. A section of 488 Squadron was also sent after the reconnaissance plane, which was hit and probably destroyed by Sergeant Pertz Killick. The Japanese Navy was back over Singapore early the next morning, sending 27 G4Ms from the Kanoya Kokutai with an escort of 3 A6Ms. These were sent to hit an aircraft carrier erroneously reported to be in Keppel Harbor, but finding no such vessel there, they attacked Tenga Airfield instead. Army bombers hit Seletar, Sembawang, and Tenga again. These raids did little damage to aircraft on the ground, but they did destroy a few dummy planes. Buffaloes from 243 Squadron, as well as 3 from the Dutch Squadron, were scrambled to intercept the Army bombers, which were covered by Key 41s of the 59th Sentai and Key 27s of the 1st Sentai. They came off the worst in this action, losing 2 pilots, Sergeant J.B. Oliver of 243 Squadron and a Dutchman, Ensign F. Swartz, in exchange for bringing down one of the Key 43s, that of Pilot Officer First Class Hiroshi Suyama. That same day, the Japanese Army also mounted an attack on the city of Singapore. The still very green 488 Squadron caught the raiders and scored their first confirmed victories over Japanese fighters, in this case a pair of Key 27s. One was shared between Sergeants D.L. Clough, W.J.N. McIntosh, and H.J. McCary. The other fell victim to Sergeant Eddie Kuhn, who describes this action in simple terms, quote, I came out of a layer of cloud and saw 2 enemy aircraft, one of which I attacked head-on. It went down into cloud, and although I never saw it crash, it landed alongside an army base and was duly confirmed. Kuhn was then embroiled with another fighter. His plane was hit and damaged, and he was unable to escape his pursuer. He was rescued by Noel Sharp, back from his detached service with 243 Squadron, who drove off the Japanese plane despite having taken off in a Buffalo with no working armament. One 488 fighter fell in this action, piloted by 26-year-old Butch Hesketh, a native of Auckland. His assailant was Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe, a member of the 47th Independent Chutai. This was an experimental unit flying early models of the Ki 44 Interceptor, known to the Japanese as the Shoki and to the Allies as the Tojo, in order to evaluate its performance in combat. At least 2 Ki 44s accompanied this raid, and this appears to have been their first mission in the theater. The Australians of the combined 21/453 Squadron of Sembawang were also in combat on this day. A group of 3 Buffaloes, led by Flight Lieutenants Vanderfield and J.R. Kinnenmont, were over the field and climbing towards 20,000 feet when they spotted a formation of 21 Ki 48 bombers some 4,000 feet or 1,800 meters below. They dove in to catch the fast twin-engine ships and engage them. Each of the section leaders brought one down. The 4th kill credited to Vanderfield, and the first of what would eventually be 6 to Kinnenmont. Kinnenmont recalls his part in the battle, quote, We whistled down and closed in. I picked off one of them and gave him a packet at 0 range. Smoke poured from his port engine, and I pulled out to watch him go down. Whether he did crash or not, I couldn't tell, as I then had a crack at one of the others. I must have hit him because oil from his engine suddenly came spurting out like a gusher, covering my aircraft to such an extent that I couldn't see a thing. I hung on to him and tried to maneuver into a favorable position. But he didn't get away unscathed. His plane was damaged by the bomber's return fire, and he was compelled to break off and make an emergency landing back at Sembawang. The Australian squadron also flew an offensive mission this day, a dozen of them flying escort for a bombing raid on a small convoy up the Malay coast. These had been sighted by a pair of Buffalo pilots that morning off Port Dickson. The bomber group was made up of 3 RAF Blenheims, 6 RAAF Hudsons, and 6 Dutch Glen Martin Model 166s. These latter were an export variant of the American B-10, considered by some to be the aircraft that set the pattern for the twin-engine monoplane bombers of the Second World War era. This plane saw some of its only combat experience lying here for the Dutch. In any case, they were unable to find the ships, and aside from a few of the Hudsons that bombed barges they found in the Lingi River, turned without dropping their bomb load. The morning of the 16th saw the return of the Navy bombers. 24 Gensen Kokutai G3Ms hit Seletar Airfield. 243 Squadron went up to oppose them, but were too late to catch the bombers. Some tangled with the escorts, and one was claimed as probably shot down. The squadron CO, Frank Howell, was unable to get to grips with the enemy in this action, largely due to the continuing bad weather. He had success later in the day, however, against a pair of C-5M Navy reconnaissance planes. Quote, "We had a pretty good idea where he was, and as we broke through the clouds, there he was, just in front of us. We moved up into position behind him, and then I let him have one good burst. The enemy immediately went straight down, bursting into flames as he went, and before he crashed, one wing came off altogether. I don't think he ever knew what hit him." This was Howell's 10th victory, and his first in the Buffalo. So accurate was his shooting that Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden, part of the intercepting section, described him in this action as, quote, "the complete professional." He positioned himself beautifully, and with his number 2, attacked this aircraft from astern and shot it down. Immediately he fired, his victim's starboard wing fell off, and the aircraft plunged into the ground. The flight armorer told me that Squadron Leader Howell had expended only 10 rounds of ammunition in the destruction of this aircraft. Offensive sorties were also flown on a concentration of Japanese transport, reported heading south on the Geman-Tampin Road. A dozen Buffaloes from the Australian squadron accompanied 6 Dutch Martin bombers, causing considerable havoc amongst the vehicles found there with strafing attacks. 6 more from 488 Squadron flew top cover for a Blenheim strike on the same target, and the combined effect of these raids was reported to be considerable. Japanese landings at Muar were also attacked by Hudsons and Buffaloes of the Australian squadron, who hit barges and landing craft there. They were on the attack once again on 17th, when 6 Australian fighters flew cover for a group of the surviving Wildebeest torpedo bombers. These had been sent to bomb the Muar landings. The slow biplanes hit their targets without interference, staying over the target for a full 45 minutes, making repeated strafing attacks after the bomb runs, and the Buffaloes added to the Japanese Army's dismay with strafing of their own. On the way back, as they crossed southwards over the Muar River, 2 Ki-27s and a Ki-43, the latter most likely flown by Lieutenant Rakuso Kato of the 64th Sentai, found the Wildebeest and moved into attack position. The Buffaloes bounced the Japanese fighters and shot down or drove them off without loss. Sergeant Alf Clare shot down one of the Ki-27s and shared credit for a Ki-43 with Vanderfield, who also shared the credit for the other Ki-27, listed as a probable, with Flight Lieutenant Grace. This action put Sergeant Clare's tally of aerial victories at 5, making him the first Allied pilot to become an ace flying the Buffalo. He wasn't the only one for long, however, as 24 Japanese G3Ms hit Sembawang just as the Australians were returning from the escort mission. Fighters from 243 Squadron, as well as a section of Dutch Buffaloes, were scrambled to intercept, and brought down at least 5 of them. One was the work of Pilot Officer Bonham, who also claimed a probable, writing this of his part in the battle, quote, "Chased enemy aircraft 50 miles, attacked 27 Type 9 Mitsubishi bombers alone. One probable, another damaged. Confirmed at a later date. Force landed at Seletar owing to rear gunners hitting the petrol tank and the hydraulics, etc." Blondie Holder and Jeff Fiskin each shot down 1 bomber, and shared credit for 2 more, with another credited to Holder as a probable. Fiskin describes this action thus, quote, "That was a big day, and we had a lovely time. We came out of cloud and we were about 4,000 feet above them, Navy Type 96 bombers in a straggled Vic formation. There was only Blondie Holder and I thought, thank God we've got the height to get some speed up. We dived and went straight through him, firing all the way, and then came up underneath him again. On each occasion, I set fire to one going down and hit another in the belly coming up. Because we had built up sufficient speed, I suppose we were doing 500 miles per hour by the time we were at the bottom of the dive, we were able to pull back up again, and we could get right up underneath their bellies before we started to slow down. We claimed 3 bombers. 2 definitely went into the jungle, before they outdistanced us, but several others were leaving trails of smoke as they disappeared over the horizon. This brought Fiskin to ace status as well, within half an hour of Claire's battle with the Army planes over Muar. Despite the comparative success in the air, bombers had devastated Sembawang and destroyed several of 453 Squadron's recently landed fighters, further depleting the already dwindling supply of Buffaloes, along with hitting 3 Hudsons and a Tiger Moth. Worse, this was the first really big raid on the field, and it caused the desertion of most of the civilian labor force. In addition, 3 Buffaloes from the Dutch squadron intercepted this raid, losing one of their number, flown by Sergeant Andreas Vorbich, who was killed, and the other 2 planes were badly shot up. Their 5 remaining planes were withdrawn from Singapore this day back to Java in order to regroup. Other raids hit Tenga and the city this day, and all the Buffalo squadrons had fighters in combat, but with little success. However, this day also saw the flight of the first formation of Hurricanes, part of the newly formed 232 Squadron, which had been assembled from the crated shipment received in the reinforcement convoy. These fighters were not yet operational, and the flight over the city was meant to boost morale, but it signaled the end of the period when the Buffaloes alone would contest the air over Singapore with the Japanese. This hardly meant that the pressure on the Buffalo squadrons was in any way reduced. On the 18th, for example, 4 of 21/453 Squadron's machines were once again in offensive action, as escorts to an early morning raid by 3 Blenheims on the railhead at Gamas. Afterwards, they flew down the west coast of Johor and strafed transport on the Gamas Road. Here the bombers were set upon by 4 Hayabusas of the 59th Sentai, who downed 2 of the bombers before the Buffaloes could intervene. On their return to Sembawang, they found the first raid of the day arriving. Another big one, made up of 26 G4Ms of the Kanoya Kokutai, along with 11 A6Ms as escort, and including a pair of C5M reconnaissance planes. 488 Squadron received sufficient warning to hit the raiders with a rare altitude advantage, and brought down 2 of the Zeros without loss. The Japanese Navy in fact acknowledged the loss of 2 A6Ms in this raid, one of which was manned by Pilot Officer 2nd Class Yoshihiro Sakuraba. 243 Squadron scrambled to join 488 Squadron, and was soon involved with the Zeros as well. These mixed it up with the Navy fighters, with Noel Sharp gaining his 3rd victory and Sergeant Ginger Baldwin also knocking down an A6M. 3 probable kills were also claimed. Sharp's Buffalo was crippled, with most of its tail shot off, but he managed to put it down safely. Later that day, the 2 squadrons would fight together again, against a raid detected inbound from the north, made up of Ki-21s from the Japanese Army's 7th Flying Battalion, escorted by the 64th Fighter Sentai. Both scrambled their available aircraft, but insufficient warning meant they were attacked at a disadvantage while still climbing. One pilot, Pilot Officer E.W. Cox of 488 Squadron, was killed, and 5 other fighters were badly damaged. One of these was Noel Sharp's, and he made his 2nd forced landing of the day. Pilot Officer Snowy Bonham had his plane shot up and his knee shattered by a machine gun round, but he managed to crash land at Kallang. He would subsequently be evacuated, and eventually fly Hawker Tempest in England, where he was credited with destroying 5 V-1 flying bombs, including 3 he destroyed by flying alongside and physically using his wingtip to roll the B-1s over, upsetting their gyroscopes and sending them out of control. The next day saw the Buffaloes employed in ground support operations around Muar, where the ground forces were in dire need of assistance. They began at first light with a scouting mission south of Malacca by a pair of Australian Buffaloes. This pair encountered a Sonia light bomber, which they attacked and shot down, the kill being credited to Flight Lieutenant Kinnenma. A little bit later, at 0700 hours, this squadron was again over Muar, 8 of its fighters escorting a force of Dutch Martin bombers and RAAF Wirraway trainers acting in their secondary ground attack role. These also encountered 3 more Sonias from the 27th Sentai, commanded by the 20-year-old 2nd Lieutenant Haruo Matsura. These were all shot down, with Sergeant K. Goring, Flight Lieutenant Vanderfield, and Flight Lieutenant R.A. Kirkman credited with the victories. For Vanderfield, this was his 5th, making him the 3rd Allied pilot to make ace flying the Buffalo. This success was tempered by the death of Sergeant H.W. Parsons, who was shot down by a Ki-43 of the 59th Sentai, when these intervened to defend the Ki-51s. In the afternoon, 5 more Australian Buffaloes were once again over Moir on a strafing mission, with 488 Squadron providing top cover. Japanese fighters hit them as they approached the target and knocked down 2 of 488's machines in their first pass. Kinnamont was able to account for one of the key 43s. Then on the 20th came the heaviest attack on Singapore up to this time, a mid-morning raid by more than 80 bombers, both Army and Navy units participating. 243 and 488 squadrons, along with Hurricanes from 232 Squadron, were scrambled to intercept, but insufficient warning again made this impossible. The Buffaloes from these units did have some success on the defensive later that day, when they caught a group of 6 Key 48s that had just hit Batu Patat, Sergeant Charlie Cronk and Pilot Officer Noel Sharp each claiming one of the bombers. The morning of the 21st began with a sweep of 6 Buffaloes over the mainland, led by Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden. 3 shot up Japanese barges, while the other 3 flew top cover above 20,000 feet. Here they tangled with Key 43s and shot down 3 of them. Both wings were seen to come off one of these fighters, and that was the second victory credited to Sergeant Bert Wapiti. In the afternoon, the Japanese Navy bombers were back over Singapore again, with more than 50 twin-engine bombers. All of 243 and 488 Squadron's Buffaloes, as well as the Hurricanes, went up to intercept, and they were successful this time, having just enough time to reach the bomber's altitude. Sergeant Ginger Baker, the ex-Blenheim night fighter pilot, shot down a G4M. Another bomber was damaged by Sergeant Jeff Fiskin. The latter then downed an A6M fighter as well, for what would be his 5th kill, making him the 4th Allied pilot to make ace in the Buffalo. It would be the last. Bombers had plastered Tenga airfield and caused further devastation in the city. By sundown, the combined strength of 243 and 488 squadrons was just 10 Buffaloes. There would be no let-up, though. The next day, 21st, the bombers were back in the late morning. Another group of more than 50 from the Genzan and the Kanoya Kokutais, the fighter escort. The G3Ms of the Genzan Kokutai hit Kelang airfield, just as 4 of 488 Squadron's Buffaloes were getting ready to take off. John Mackenzie, one of the pilots, remembers it thus, quote, "I remember the bombs going across and past me on the right wing. It's a frightening thing when the airfield blows up in front of you." A few of 243 Squadron's fighters and a handful of the Hurricanes were able to get up and mix it with the Raiders, Hurricanes trying to keep the fighters occupied, while the Buffaloes went after the bombers. Bert Wapiti was able to claim one before the Zeros slashed into the Buffaloes, shooting down and killing Sergeants Vin Arthur and Ginger Baldwin. Kelang Field was devastated in this raid. The losses suffered on this day reduced the squadron to a mere handful of flyable planes, and dealt a severe blow to the morale of the survivors. The next few days saw some attempts to provide support to the ground troops fighting on the mainland, but nothing substantial could be mounted until the 26th, when the Japanese landed troops at Endau, on the Malayan east coast. An attack was mounted on the transports by the remaining wildebeests of 30 and 100 squadrons, as well as the surviving RAAF Hudsons. The Australian Buffaloes and what was left of 243 Squadron was sent to cover them. 243 Squadron with the wildebeests and the Australians with the Hudsons. They found the target in more or less clear weather. Transports and landing craft engaged in putting the troops ashore. They were met by Key 27 fighters over the target, and though 3 Japanese fighters were destroyed, they were unable to prevent the bombers from suffering crippling losses. Little effect was had on the landings. The next day, an attack on Kelang cost 243 Squadron 2 more of its planes. It was at this point that the squadron was disbanded. Its few remaining planes, along with a few pilots, were transferred to 453 Squadron. At the same time, 488 Squadron traded its Buffaloes for Hurricanes, and the remains of 21 Squadron were evacuated to Australia. This left 453 as the sole remaining Buffalo squadron on the island. It continued to see action for the next couple weeks, though difficulties in keeping the worn-out, patched-together Buffaloes serviceable greatly lessened the pace of operations. Another reinforcement convoy arrived on the 28th, and it was covered by Buffaloes on the way in. Unfortunately, the men and arms carried by this convoy were delivered into an all-but-hopeless situation. A few days later, on the 31st, the causeway linking the island to the mainland was cut, and the Gibraltar of the East made ready for its last stand. The next day, on the 1st of February, Jeff Fiskin, one of the few remaining pilots, fought his last action in the Buffalo, describing it in these words, quote, "By the 1st of February 1942, I already had 5 victories against various Japanese aircraft. Little did I know that this would be my last fight in the Buffalo. Pushing my nose over and picking up speed, I hurtled down at a swarm of Zeros below. I picked one out and gave him a 3-second burst. With no protective armor, it burst into flames and cartwheeled down. 2 of his friends lashed onto me and tried to shake them. I got a bit of cannon shell in the leg and a bullet in the arm. Buffalo was chewed to pieces as I dove for the deck. My undercarriage was shot out, and my engine was coughing and smoking as my prop stopped. I managed to bring it into Klang, crash landing there. I busted up my knee in the process, but other than that I was alright. With my arm in a plaster and me walking on a stick, I wasn't much use to RNZAF. On 12 February, I and some others were loaded into a sampan and delivered to a larger ship that took us back to New Zealand. With this, his 6th kill, Fiskin achieved the distinction of downing the largest number of any aircraft shot down by any Allied Buffalo pilot, or any pilot outside of the Finnish Air Service. By the 6th, conditions on the island had made further operations impossible. On that day, the remaining flyable Buffaloes, just 4 in number, were evacuated to Palembang on the island of Java. One other made it out of Singapore a few days later, a hastily repaired machine piloted by one of the Hurricane pilots that was left on the island. These pilots and planes thus escaped. All that remained of the 4 squadrons that stood ready for war just 2 months before. The ground personnel were not so lucky. Ordered to stay behind and fight as infantry, they died on the island, or fell into brutal Japanese captivity, along with the rest of the Allied troops when the final surrender came on the 15th. And that is where I will end this video, and with it the story of the Brewster Buffalo and the air defense of Malaya and Singapore. I hope you found something interesting or useful in this story. Next time we'll continue the story of the Buffalo and the resistance to this Japanese push southwards, detailing the operations of the Dutch colonial Buffalo squadrons and the defense of the Dutch East Indies. Subsequent to that episode, we'll move on to the last major portion of the Buffalo's service career, in British hands against the concurrent Japanese drive into Burma. So I hope you'll join me for that. Until that time, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.